Okay, let's dive straight into something that, well, it can give even the most convinced among us a moment of pause. The
Hmm.
fact that we don't actually have the original manuscripts of the Bible.
Right. Autographs.
Yeah, it's a thought that for some might spark, a little doubt. For others, maybe even makes them sweat a bit.
It absolutely brings up a fundamental question, doesn't it? How reliable can a text really be, especially one this important, when the very first copies are, well, missing?
Exactly. So that's really our focus for this deep dive today. We want to explore why the absence of those original pages doesn't automatically, tear down the trustworthiness of the Bible we have.
Yeah, how do we navigate that?
Our aim is to understand what actually holds up its reliability and maybe what's really important when we engage with these ancient writings.
And it's a fascinating area because it forces us to look beyond just the physical documents themselves, doesn't it?
How
Well, we have to consider how they were transmitted, the dedication of the people copying them for thousands of years, and ultimately what the purpose of these writings was intended to be.
Okay, so when you start digging into the evidence, one of the first things that jumps out is just how much stuff we do have.
Oh, absolutely.
We're not talking about just a couple of scraps here, are we?
Not at all. Our sources point out we have like under 10,000 biblical fragments and manuscripts, some nearly complete.
10,000. That's a huge number.
It really is. And, to put that in context, this deep dive highlights it's far more evidence than we have for other major ancient figures and texts. Think Homer or Aristotle.
Right. So compared to other ancient literature, the Bible's manuscript evidence is like off the charts.
Pretty much. And this sheer volume, this abundance, it gives scholars an incredible opportunity.
How does that help?
Well, it allows them to cross-check and verify the text with remarkable precision. You can compare all these different copies from different times and places.
Okay, so lots of copies helps confirm the text. But that brings up the next question, doesn't it? Accuracy.
Mhm.
Over centuries, with so many people copying by hand. Surely mistakes crept in. The source mentions textual differences or variants. That sounds potentially worrying.
It's a totally fair concern.
Yeah.
And yes, there are variants. But here's the key thing. The overwhelming majority of them are actually, well, insignificant.
Insignificant how? Like what?
Think minor stuff. A misspelled word, maybe a couple of letters reversed, slightly different word order that doesn't change the meaning. The kinds of small slips anyone might make copying something by hand.
Okay, so we're not talking about like changing who Jesus is or the main commandment.
Exactly. That's the crucial point. Our sources really emphasize that none affect core doctrine or the overall narrative.
Ah, okay. That's big.
Yeah. The fundamental teachings, the central story, the main message, it stays remarkably consistent across all these thousands of manuscripts.
That's a really important distinction to make. And these variations, they aren't like hidden away in some vault, are they? The deep dive stresses the transparency here.
Absolutely not hidden. It says every known variant is accounted for. That's quite a statement, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Scholars have meticulously cataloged, studied, and published every single variation they've found across these thousands of ancient documents. It's all out there.
So, no secret committee deciding to change things, no conspiracy.
None. The source is clear. No conspiracy, nothing's being swept under the rug. This level of open scholarly work really underlines the integrity of the whole process.
It's also interesting to see what historians, maybe even skeptical ones, say about the evidence. The deep dive quotes Bart Ehrman, he's a New Testament scholar, calls himself agnostic. What's his take?
Well, Urban says, pretty bluntly, we have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from Jesus' time period.
Wow, that's quite something, especially coming from his perspective, right?
Exactly. The source even notes, if someone like Ehrman is saying it, it's worth paying attention.
Yeah, definitely. It suggests that even just looking at it historically, without any faith lens, the evidence for the core figures and events is substantial.
It really does.
And it wasn't just the sheer number of copies, was it? It seems the scribes themselves were incredibly careful.
Astonishingly careful, yeah.
The deep dive mentions manuscripts from way back, like 800 BC, are astonishingly close, within about 10% to copies made in AD 1500. That's over 2,000 years of hand copying.
It's mind-boggling, really.
Yeah.
Try copying anything by hand, even a short book, and see how many little errors creep in. Now imagine that over millennia.
So what kind of differences make up that roughly 10%? Still mostly minor things.
But generally, yes.
Yeah.
You'd find variations in spelling conventions that changed over time, maybe slight differences in phrasing or word order that don't impact the core meaning. The fact they kept it that consistent, the source calls it practically miraculous.
Yeah, you really start to appreciate the dedication involved there.
Definitely.
Well, okay, let's tackle what the deep dive calls the theological elephant in the room.
Yes. Why no originals?
Right. If the Bible is so important, why wouldn't God, preserve the very first ones perfectly, keep them safe in a divine vault somewhere?
It's a great question. And the perspective offered is, well, it's thought-provoking. The source suggests that maybe God doesn't ask us to worship the paper it was written on.
Okay. So the focus isn't meant to be on the physical object.
That seems to be the idea. It clarifies that God doesn't demand devotion to a static, perfect text. Instead, God asks us to devote ourselves to Him.
So the words point beyond the page.
Exactly. The word is living, the source says, not because it's printed in red letters or on ancient papyrus, but because it points to a living God.
Huh. That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It makes the Bible's authority less about a perfect physical artifact and more about its power to connect us to God.
Precisely. And that connection that deep dive suggests comes through this narrative that was shaped and shared, well, in community, across cultures and centuries, written by real people experiencing a real God.
So the fact that humans were involved with all the potential messiness that entails, that's not necessarily a flaw. Maybe it's part of the point.
That's the intriguing idea presented, that maybe God gave us something better than a single, pristine original, something living, dynamic, a story told through human experience.
Which I guess means we can't just dip in and out picking the verses we like. The source warns against that, right? It mentions engaging with Scripture in its entirety.
Absolutely. It encourages tracing the character of God from Genesis to Revelation, seeing if the same God, the same core character, shows up consistently throughout the whole story.
So it's about the big picture, the whole narrative arc, not just isolated proof texts.
Right. Because, as the deep dive puts it very clearly, the Bible isn't a rule book. It's a relationship.
That phrase really sticks out. It's a relationship. That's a very different way of thinking about it for some people, I imagine.
It really is. And it brings in N.T. Wright's perspective here, too. He says the Bible is not just a repository of timeless truths or moral maxims.
Okay, so what is it then, according to Wright?
It's a narrative, a story that helps us understand not just who God is, but what God is doing in the world and how we're invited to participate in that.
Wow, so it's an invitation to join a story that's already unfolding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if we just treat it like a document to dissect, like an instruction manual or, a historical artifact only,
We miss the point.
we miss its point entirely, according to this view.
Hmm.
The deep dive says, the story of Scripture isn't about preserving ink on a page. It's about a God who speaks through human voices and invites us to live within the story ourselves.
Okay, so that brings us right back around to where we started. Considering all this, is the Bible reliable? Can we trust its God to speak through it, even without those first edition copies?
And the source doesn't just give a simple yes or no, does it? It kind of throws it back to us.
Yeah, it says, only one way to find out. You have to read it, engage with it, let it confront and comfort you. It's presented as a personal challenge, an invitation.
A very direct invitation. And it acknowledges this isn't always easy, right? It's not necessarily straightforward.
No, it admits it leaves room for doubt, for wrestling, even rejection, which sounds whiskey.
It does. But the suggestion is that this very openness, this space for genuine, sometimes tough engagement, might actually reflect the kind of relationship God is looking for.
How so?
One that's real, not rigid. One that allows space for mystery, even as it leads us toward truth. It embraces the complexity.
Messy. Absolutely. But the best stories, usually.
They often are. They draw you in, make you think, make you feel. They're not always tied up neatly.
And maybe that's the thought to leave things on for this deep dive. The idea that the messiness of how the Bible came down to us isn't a bug, but maybe a feature, part of what makes it a real living story.
Yeah. It invites you not just to read about it, but to step into it.
So we definitely encourage you to mull over these ideas, maybe dig into some of the resources around textual criticism if you're curious, but more than that, perhaps just engage with the text itself.
See what happens.
Maybe these questions, these complexities we've touched on aren't roadblocks after all. Maybe they're actually invitations to go deeper, to find a more authentic kind of understanding.
A journey worth taking.